Thank you, everyone, for joining us. So, yeah, this is the Microservices panel. So, really excited to have all of you here. And I hope you've enjoyed the talk so far. In our final talk, we had Chris, who's obviously joining us now in the panel. We've got two new people as well. We've got James Lewis and Katie Gamanji. So just to give brief introductions, so Chris spoke, as I said earlier, about minimizing design time coupling in microservices. And he's the creator of Microservices.io, author of the Microservices Patterns book, and he's also a Java champion, so really experienced in the microservices space. And I look forward to digging into some of these areas with you. Of course, we've got James Lewis then, one of the original people to actually coin and define the term or the architectural style that we call microservices today. So James is software architect and director at ThoughtWorks, member of the ThoughtWorks Technical Advisory Board and the group that creates the Technology Radar, which many of you are probably familiar with, working to contribute to the industry adoption of open source and other tools and techniques. And then we've got Katie Gamanji. And Katie is the ecosystem technical advocate at CNCF. And her focus is very much on the broader ecosystem and the tooling which can help microservices survive and thrive. So she helps to grow and lead the end user community while bridging the gap with some of the other ecosystem areas and the units there. So her past roles have included cloud platform engineer, and she's built quite a few platforms that have gravitated towards cloud-native technologies, and that includes with Kubernetes. So welcome to you all. Delighted to have you here. I thought maybe what we can start off with is just a question on actually microservices as a definition. Does it actually still mean the things that we think it means today? So, I mean, James, you coined the term, a while ago. And if we think about agile, agile maybe doesn't quite mean the same today as it does today. So are microservices still the same thing as it was a decade ago?
What was it, James?
I don't know. Yeah, I should point out, in the interest of complete, openness, it wasn't just me. There was also a guy called Fred Jewell, and Adrian Cockcroft was talking about fine-grained SOA and microservices at the same time. So there was I think it was just one of those ideas, sort of convergent evolution or whatever it's called. It was sort of an idea its time has come. I mean, at the time, it was very much a reaction to the sort of the technology-focused approach to developing software at scale. So, we were focused on the technical layers and all the kind of the tools and technologies, and I think we really wanted to bring that away from that towards more of a sort of business, to focus more on the business and bring more DDD into play, bring more of the businent capabilities idea into play, and in essence, I sort of think of it really as sort of, it's a bit like extreme programming. Kent Beckel, I think, was sort of quoted as saying, it's just doing all the good stuff all at once and turned up to 11. And I think that's really what microservices architecture was about. It was taking a lot of the ideas that were present at the time and putting them all together in one place. If you think about, the sort of guerrilla service-oriented architecture that was around at the time, I know Chris knows Jim Weber pretty well, and he sort of originated that idea. Obviously, domain-driven design, looking at RESTful integration, that was a big part of it, and sort of decoupling via hypermedia. So it was just, does it mean the same thing now? No, of course it's not. It's 10 years later. Semantic diffusion, as you sort of say, Nikki, is a thing. Mm-hmm. Words change their meaning. And actually, looking back, I think Martin and I would both agree we got the name wrong. It's catchy and it's stuck, but really it's not about size so much. But then when Martin names something, it tends to stay named. So I don't know what the other people think.
You should have gone with service-oriented architecture. It would have eliminated some anti-patterns.
Well, of course, Dan North prefers, replaceable component architectures, which is probably a more apt description of really what it's about. It's about designing for replaceability, over maintenance. Really, that was the original thing. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. Excellent. So, I mean, we've had, quite a while having a go at microservices, and there's been, I think, a lot of things we've done maybe right, but there's quite a few, what I would say, sort of anti-patterns out there. So, what are your guys' opinions in terms of the most prevalent or common anti-patterns that you see coming up over and over again, in terms of how people, implement microservices and use them?
Well, I mean, I would say one obvious one is people believing it's like a magic pixie dust. Our engineering organization delivers software slowly. We'll just do microservices and everything will be great, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas in reality, if your software delivery is slow because of your process, because of lack of automated testing, and and that you write code that's unmaintainable, then adding microservices to the mix will most likely make things worse. And so I feel like you actually have to kind of clean up your act and kind of raise the maturity of your organization before you can, or in addition to, before adopting microservices or simultaneously with adopting microservices. Assuming that microservices are actually the part of the solution, right? Because if you just improve all the other stuff, that can be good enough.
Yeah.
I could echo that. I think this is a pattern that I've seen when the adoption of containers got a bit more momentum. But it's not about the containers. It's not about the technology. It's about understanding what your problem is and actually getting to the core of it. And most of the time, this comes with a cultural shift as well, or development. So it's not just about adopting microservices. It's about to truly understand what you're trying to solve, and with that, try to apply some of the best practices. So talking about anti-patterns, there have been a lot of use cases where microservices were adopted, but there still was code which was not very well maintained. It was still difficult to deploy. Automation was not part of it. Pretty much some of the functionalities that Chris already mentioned as well. Metrics of success as well is not something which is necessarily truly well defined. Some of the organizations measure their success by number of microservices they have, which is not actually what you should aim for, isn't it? So I think it's not about just the technology, it's about the cultural shift and truly understanding the root of the problem that you're trying to solve.
Yeah, there was once an organization I did some work with, so they remain nameless, but CIO read an ebook that I wrote and then got all gung-ho about microservices and told top-down 8,000 person organization, he just announced that do microservices. And that got translated into KPIs, which translate into bonuses and stuff. And it was like do a number of microservices kind of determined your bonus, basically.
Wow.
That's not what we meant at all.
I can tell your fault, James.
One thing I've seen a lot, I mean, it's a previous client I was at, which is quite fun, this is around sort of distributed transactions. When you end up with lots and lots of services and you end up having to coordinate transactions and have orchestration across these microservices, which can be a nightmare. Sam Newman and myself always sort of said in our training courses that the best thing to do if you think you might need a distributed transaction, roll those things together, because they probably need to be in the same place. I remember being at one organization where they'd sort of implemented this weird kind of, I think they called them business, they had entity services and then a business orchestration service that would coordinate transactions across these sort of entity services. And the way they'd implemented it was as a thread local. So each call would be stored in a thread local in a stack. And so if they needed to then unwind the distributed transaction, they'd kind of, unwind the stack and issue rollbacks against each of these services. We kind of thought this is kind of, well done for a start, because that's quite a hard problem to solve. But then what happens if you need two of them? what happens if you need 2 of these things in case, you need to scale? And they said, we've got a plan for that. We're going to bring the Zookeeper in. So now they had all the problems, right? Because now they've got the Zookeeper problems as well. We all know it can be a bit of a rascal. But of course, every time they were issuing a request against one of these microservices, they had to also talk to Zookeeper. It was interesting. So distributed transactions, I always sort of feel is something to watch out for if you're building a microservices architecture.
Yeah, I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago, or in the past anyway, dark matter, dark energy, which was all about like the conflicting forces that want you to decompose, and then the forces that cause attraction between services, and transactions is one kind of key attractive force that resists decomposition.
Yeah, I think also seeing the distributed monolith is something that I've seen a fair amount of time actually in some of the clients that we work with as well, where there's just so many services, and things like the entity service anti-pattern, I think, is something when you're decomposing from a monolith into microservices, just having some of these very sort of traditional concepts, and then you have to put everything together, as you say, with transactions and all these things spanning multiple calls. So excellent. So, I mean, one thing in terms of microservices that you can't get away with nowadays is Kubernetes seems to be going hand in hand with microservices, sometimes even interchangeably used in those sentences. So how has Kubernetes influenced and shaped microservices as we've gone forward?
I don't know if you want to take that, Katie, or I can go first.
Yeah, I could definitely kind of start answering this question. So the introduction of Kubernetes was pretty much the adoption of containers. And with Kubernetes, we have a container orchestrator, which helps us to deploy those containers. But it's not just about deploying the application. It's about some of the extra functionalities that Kubernetes brings. For example, we're talking about scalability. We have an horizontal pod autoscaler, which automatically will identify when the application is to be scaled or not. It has readiness and liveness probes, which will make sure that your application is even restarted or your container is restarted to make sure that the service is up and running. We have a lot of other functionality, such as declarative configuration. We have decoupling from the physical infrastructure layer, because all you have to think about is how you define your application within the Kubernetes world, with resources such as deployment, replica sets, services, and so forth. However, with Kubernetes, again, it's a mechanism to host an application, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can apply some of the best practices to the phase when you deploy or developing your application. So there has been many cases when entire monoliths have been deployed to Kubernetes, to the platform, and it's going to run. It's going to consume a lot of resources. It's not going to be the most efficient way to run your application, but it actually enables you to do that as well. So with Kubernetes, I think it enabled for a faster, if you look into a good kind of a positive perspective, it enabled for applications to be deployed faster, but at the same time have some of these capabilities that I've been mentioning about. So reachability, automation, scalability, readiness probes, liveness probes, and so forth. So all of this actually is something which truly takes the shift from how you deploy your application to just deploy your application, containerize it, actually just package it with a tool such as Docker or build packs, whatever is the tool of choice in-house, and that is sufficient to actually have it ready to be deployed within a cluster.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sorry, go, Chris.
No, you go.
I sort of see. I was just looking at our radar, the ThoughtWorks technology radar, and Kubernetes first appeared in Assess in 2015, when I think Google's just open sourced it at the time. Microservices first appeared like a little bit before that, and Docker appeared a little bit before that. But I think the patterns we're talking about that Kubernetes enables, they're sort of older patterns, right? So I remember, I don't know if anyone remembers Drop Wizard, which was sort of fallen out of fashion a little bit, but previous to Drop Wizard, there was a Java library from the same individual coder Twitter handlers called Metrics, and that was a classic example of putting a simple library in that you'd hit an endpoint, and every application would have this library, and every application would have an endpoint, and it would give you your service uptime. It would give you your request response, latencies, and all that kind of stuff. And of course, that's sort of evolved into now out of your application and into the infrastructure. And I think that's really fascinating, actually, like the evolution of the essential complexity remaining where it is in the the business code, if you like. But then the accidental complexity, which is Martin Fowler's original point, that the accidental complexity is migrating into your network. Into your service meshes, into your sidecars, into your container runtimes, into your orchestration tools. So I think that's kind of an interesting trajectory that we're going on. Maybe we'll end up with just the business analyst being able to drag and drop stuff together and then deploy it into Kubernetes. You never know.
Do you think Kubernetes is the right abstraction level? Do you think it's the right abstraction level, or do you think we still need to build more of the ecosystem on top of it to make it easier for people to build microservices? Because some of the stuff's quite low level.
Well, I mean, I have a sort of a few different points. I mean, I think first and foremost, the essence of what the microservice architecture is about is not really technical or sort of infrastructure related. It's all about correctly identifying service boundaries, service responsibilities, their APIs, their collaborations, right? I mean, that is the kind of the essence of the microservice architecture. And in terms of the decisions, the numerous decisions that you must make when developing a system, that's like, those are the absolutely critical decisions, right?
Yeah.
And I think that another microservices adoption anti-pattern is it's kind of inverting it and thinking, oh, let's figure out our deployment technology, our tools, our literal technologies, and that's very much an anti-pattern. It's really all about service definitions. And then, so where does Kubernetes fit in? I view it as one of many possible deployment options, right? Like one obvious alternative would be serverless, right? Like package stuff up as AWS Lambdas and say run it on AWS or Google Cloud Functions, and if that's not a good fit, then look at using a Docker-based solution, and ECS is, say, one option there that can be simpler, say, than Kubernetes. But then Kubernetes is actually quite good, and it's also sort of this kind of, it's available everywhere, right? It runs from a Raspberry Pi to the public cloud and everything in between. So that's quite appealing. But I sort of view it as a deployment option and not something that is intrinsically bound up to the definition of microservices.
Yeah.
I could actually add here a bit, because I think with the popularity of Kubernetes, at the same time, we had another kind of cultural pattern that has been quite prominent, and I'm clearly here defining the DevOps. So this is, again, it's not a procedure to deploy, it's a cultural shift, a collaboration methods between the team. And I think this is actually quite important, because when we're talking about defining what our service can do, especially in an architecture where we have a myriads of services out there and have different teams taking control of them, how do you make sure that you have your APIs available out there? How do you make sure you have synchronization and awareness of how can you consume an API? How can you if you have a feature request, how can you reach out to that team? And this thing has been, I think, more emphasized by the DevOps culture, which introduced the infrastructure layer, or let's put the platform team, to collaborate closer to the applications team, to make sure that all of the needs that the service or an application requires, they're going to be met by the platform team as well. So I think it's about kind of defining your application, but at the same time, it's kind of the next stage is how do you deliver it to the consumers. And sometimes there is required of a better clarity or awareness of where your application is going to be deployed, so you can make the best of the infrastructure you have. And that as well comes with a collaboration process in between the teams.
It's interesting, isn't it? This kind of idea of standardization as well, because I mean, we used to have a thing we talked about a little while ago called domain application protocols, and they were quite sort of linked to things like micro formats in RESTful architectures and things. And that's something that I don't really see teams sort of talking about so much anymore. I think that's coming back to what you're saying, Chris, which is what are the important things? And the important things are, how do these things communicate? What are the what are the APIs? What's the protocol by which I know I can talk to this other team over here? I'm using team synonymously with service boundaries, by the way. And I think that's something that's a really, that seems to be disappearing. I don't know if anyone else is seeing that, but this idea that we're actually going to sit down and solve the hard problem, which is, what are the boundaries? What are the interfaces between our services? And let's agree on a common way of talking to one another, because that's essentially the semantic gap. That's the semantic problem, which you can't really solve via technology. You can only solve that via people talking to each other.
Yeah, we had in some of the previous talks, there's quite a lot around the collaboration that's required to actually work out how to solve some of these challenges. And yeah, I mean, Conway's law also is something that often comes up in terms of how sort of designing your services either around the organization or vice versa. And I think quite often we find that with microservice architectures is to try and help organizations go faster, but often it doesn't happen because the organization doesn't actually change at the same time. I don't know what your experiences are around that. How much challenges have you had on the human side of things to actually get people to change the organizational side in collaboration with the technical side?
Yeah, humans, they're trouble. Yeah, I mean, I use this concept of a success triangle, and it's like, in order to deliver software rapidly, frequently, reliably, and sustainably, you need the combination of three things, right? And from a process point of view, it's lean and it's DevOps. From an organizational point of view, it's a loosely coupled network of empowered product teams. And then from an architecture perspective, it's a loosely coupled modular architecture, which sometimes is microservices, sometimes it's a monolith. But you need all three of those in order to achieve the goal of rapid and reliable software development.
Well, it's like, I guess, sorry, Nikki, I guess it's like the old adage around, you can, when we used to talk, when continuous delivery was a new thing and build pipelines were a new thing, you'd sort of find people who'd spend months and months and months defining and building the perfect build pipeline to get your software into production. We can get our software into production on demand really, really fast. Great. What software? Oh, we haven't got any software, right? And that's a classic thing. Yeah, I mean, if anyone else has seen that, but that's definitely a thing.
Oh, yeah.
How good your build pipeline is, if you haven't got any working software to push through it, then that's solving real business problems or producing real outcomes. Then you're not gonna deliver anything, right? So.
I can only add to this that it's quite important to maybe do very well strategical upskilling in-house in terms of the engineering team. So like if we adopt a kind of a new concept to deploy applications or to create applications internally, I think it's quite important to create these internal standards that the employees can abide by. So I think that's quite important. Clear communication, transparency, and opportunities to upskills. But yeah, I think the human problem is always going to be there. It's like we have different approaches to deal with it, though.
I think organizations find every possible reason not to change. Eli Goldratt, years and years ago, he talked to, I think it was in the goal. There's a one of the relations of the goal. He talks about paradigm shifts, and it's the hardest thing for people and organizations to do is to shift paradigm. And something like microservices style of architecture, adopting cloud native, that is a massive shift. It is a huge paradigm shift because it is about people. It's about team structures. It's about, I think we forget things like, for Amazon, Jeff Bezos didn't say build microservices, right? He said there was a bunch of other stuff, other constraints, other forcing functions, including things like have a direct line of sight to your customer, build product teams as Chris was saying, have small empowered teams who manage everything themselves. It's all of that stuff, and that is such a paradigm shift.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I just finished. But Eli Goldwright, he says you need three things to change paradigm. You need the first thing you need to do is to have tried everything else within the existing paradigm. You need to be under a massive amount of pressure, and you need someone to help you take the first step. And of course, ThoughtWorks is always available to help, as is Katie.
Indeed.
Yeah, me too.
And you, Katie, as well?
Yeah, I'm free. Yeah, anything cloud native, I'm here.
Excellent. I mean, on that note, I wonder if I don't know if any of you have come across the book Team Topologies at all, and the sort of having to change your teams actually as you evolve along your journey. And sometimes you might have sort of full stack product teams type thing, but you might have platform teams in different sort of interaction modes. And I think that's something which it's maybe lost along the way, because you find companies tend to set up and they say, this is our structure, this is how we're going to do things, and it doesn't change as the organization and as the architecture actually changes. Is there any advice or anything that you've seen for how to actually influence management and leadership to be able to recognize this and adapt?
Well, I think ultimately, right, not being profitable or declining profitability of a company, I think, is the ultimate motivator for most business people, right? And sadly or not sadly, most organizations tend to not have such an immediate crisis, right? But if they do, then that's one of those really compelling reasons to change and transform, right?
Mm-hmm.
I once worked with one customer. They're a super successful company, but they had this aging monolith, and which was deployed on-prem, and they had, because it was so large and old, they had difficulty testing it, and so it was kind of buggy, and customers were terrified to upgrade, and because that meant downtime, and that translated into a business problem the business could understand, right? Because it involved money, and then that actually motivated them to start looking at the microservice architecture so they could carve pieces off and then test them thoroughly.
I could maybe so the thing is, I think this is the same problem space, but it can be applied to different domains as well. So Chris has been talking about the adoption or maybe encouragement to use microservices. I've seen a very similar pattern when adopting Kubernetes as a platform. So it comes down to the same core principles. Every single business would like to have a differentiator which will allow them to deploy their functionalities to the customers as quickly as possible. And for that, sometimes when it comes to the platform, we can really make a really good use case that this is something that not only will reduce the cost for maintaining your infrastructure, but will enable your team to have more control and maybe do some of the lifecycle management operations, such as upgrading and updating the cluster easier, making sure that you have kind of doors open to introduce new technologies, for example, service meshes that are out there. So I think it's, again, having a kind of a business differentiator usually comes down to technology, but at different stages within a company, it can be either the adoption of microservices, or it can be the adoption of containers and Kubernetes or a cloud provider and so forth. So I think it's kind of an undergoing problem, which is how can the company or the organization be profitable?
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah, just on that topic of team topologies, there's another really great book, and I can never pronounce Heidi's surname, so I'm just going to mention the book, which is Dynamic Reteaming. And yeah, I won't embarrass myself, but Heidi read it. It's a brilliant book, and it's about different techniques for actually changing how your teams are structured, not necessarily like in the team topology sense from a platform team to a product team to whatever it is, but in terms of rotating people, keeping people fresh, keeping people's ideas, keeping people engaged. The best example of a company I've seen that sort of does this, and does it very well, is Redgate, who make the sort of database tooling. Originally for SQL Server, now for other databases are also available. And they do this very, very successfully. They enable their people to move around between the different products. They almost have like a poster session where every several months, the developers will choose which product to work on within reason, clearly. But the thing that enables that for Redgate, and I think this is the thing you don't see in many organizations, especially the larger ones that so Chris is talking about, I guess, putting words in your mouth, but is they've got truly transformational leadership. They've got built a learning culture, not just on their teams around technology and practices and patterns and things, but around management practices and around transformational leadership. And I think that's the thing that a lot of organizations are missing, is this idea that we're not just stuck in our ways. We don't just do it this one way forever. We have to adapt. We have to learn. We have to learn new techniques, new styles, new organizational structures, and keep up to date in that sort of field as well as managers, rather than sort of stick with the thing we've always done.
Yeah, I think sometimes trying to have these initiatives done from the grassroots, it doesn't work unless you have the buy-in from management and leadership, really, because you can try till you're blue in the face, but if it's not understood higher up, it can certainly be a challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Let's see what we got. About 10 minutes. So, in terms of maybe the future of microservices and where we're going. Do you have any sort of ideas on maybe what the latest trends are that you're seeing in either sort of the CNCF or in your clients, in terms of what is up and coming for microservices? What's the next evolution or the next thing that we should be looking at?
I could start off on this one. So there are a couple of methodologies or tools that I would like to mention here. When it comes to application development specifically, when you're talking about Kubernetes and cloud native, it has been all around the cluster, how you define your applications in configuration using Kubernetes resources and so forth. However, there is a shift nowadays where the focus is put on the application developers fully. And that's how the open application model has been constructed, and it has been outsourced 2 years ago in 2019. And this pretty much allows to shift this focus from the infrastructure layer to the application layer. And most importantly, you'll be able to define your application in code, in config, and you'll be able to deploy it across cloud providers. It's not just about Kubernetes. If you'd like to deploy it within a data center or a cloud provider, you'll be able to use this particular tool as well. Another thing that I would like to mention from the cloud native space, which focuses on the application development phase, is Gitpod. Now, what Gitpod is pretty much a tool which codifies the local environment, so your local development environment. And this is a huge enabler, especially if someone is creating or developing an application locally, they meet a bug, they will be able to codify that fully. And it's all based on Git repositories, and you'll be able to, with just like one file, or even the Git repository, like everything is there. Someone else will be able to fully recreate that. And it's going to be a mirror image of what the other engineer had. So this kind of portable development environments, this has been a focus as well. And in terms of the actual deployments of the application, of course, we have different methodologies, to enable that quicker push of our applications to a production environment. And this is where GitOps has been quite prominent. It is a mechanism which, again, you store the desired state of your applications within Git repositories. However, it really enables or changes the way a developer would deploy their application to a cluster. So there's what I'm trying to say for all of these tools and methodologies. Kubernetes is here to stay. We have many surveys that are out there confirming this data. So we have one of the latest surveys for the state of Kubernetes from VMware. And again, year to year, they see an increase of Kubernetes being used in production. And it's not just about infrastructure nowadays. We're trying to enhance the developer experience. And this is where all of these tools and methodology that I've mentioned, they came up kind of really flourish, and they actually gaining a lot of momentum lately.
All right. James, what do you reckon?
So for me, the technology is one thing. That's evolving. There's been this giant explosion. If you look back, I did a talk where I was looked back at where microservices first appeared, what came before it, and sort of what comes after it. And you get this massive explosion in monitoring, in logging, in container run orchestration, boom, which is fantastic. And that I'm sure will continue because it makes a lot of people a lot of money as well, for a start, being cynical. But I think for me, we still haven't cracked the actual, the stuff that's more around domains, the stuff that's more around business architecture. How do we, what the boundaries are, as Chris is saying. Chris is doing a brilliant job of starting to codify a lot of this as patterns. Other people are doing similar work. But I think that's, for me, that's the message that still hasn't landed. It's about business, it's about team structure, it's about focusing on how to solve business problems. And I think there's still maybe too much of a focus still on technology, and I think we still need to crack that bit. Not many people still read the Blue Book. Eric Evans' Blue Book that seems to be declining in popularity. Although Data Mesh is now bringing it back into popularity again, apparently. So, but I think the domain-driven design, business capability, and that sort of stuff, I think is still at the heart of the future of services.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously the technology will continue to evolve, and though, as I said, I feel like that's not the core of what microservice is about. I mean, this is a joke, by the way, but maybe XML will make a comeback instead of YAML. I just wanted to say that.
Rather than tunnel XML in YAML, right, or in JSON.
I was about to say, we're going to replace everything with YAML here. There has been actually a project, which is quite funny, which allows you to manage your applications using Excel spreadsheets. So it can get worse if needed.
Wow. Yeah, but everything is just YAML. It's really funny. Actually, in more seriousness, I wish Lisp was the configuration language. I feel that would be a much better approach. I mean, I feel like there's sort of two levels to the problem, and one, I totally agree with James about kind of codifying best practices around design, and I think domain-driven design is the Blue Book by Eric Evans is key there, and related stuff. And then the other part of this is this whole monolith versus microservices argument. It's it would be great if, I mean, there's Twitter. Well, first off, we should stop using Twitter to discuss architecture. It's a terrible format for that. But all of those debates, and if you post an article a tweet saying monoliths are good, the level of engagement is off the charts, right? But I wish we could all agree on sort of where the monolith architecture is applicable and where the microservice architecture is applicable, because clearly they're both applicable, and we just have to figure out when.
Yeah.
Right. So,
absolutely.
So that debate to just come to some conclusion.
Just as a I guess a heads up on that point, everyone, that one of my colleagues, Neil Ford, is obviously quite well known in the architecture space. Has written a bunch of stuff around this. I think they've got a book. Him and Mark Richardson have a book coming out fairly soon. I think it's called Architecture: The Hard Parts, and it talks very much, Chris, about this. They've got a really nice. Spoil it because it's their baby. So, but they've got a really nice model around how to consider what the sort of granularity of service or granularity of application. So yeah, just keep an eye out for that. I'm sure.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good.
And
Excellent.
maybe I could finish with one sentence. It's about identifying what is the best architecture for your product to be deployed, but at the same time, I would like to remind that it's about iteration as well. What works for you at the moment might not work for you in a couple of years. So try to build for the problems in the future, which will help you to have maintainable code bases. Sorry. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent. I'm afraid we have run out of time, but there is still the speakers hangouts after this, and maybe we could dive into some of those more meatier things, because I think people probably have a few questions there as well around some of the service boundaries and how to do that properly. I think that would be That would be great. So thank you so much for being part of the panel. It was great to chat, and I hope all of you enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll see you in the Hangouts. So thank you very much, everybody.